Sup Shredders, my name is Logan aka Spiderhands, and welcome to an SB Reacts, where today we got ourselves 6 tracks from an act named Spaceman 5.0, the first of these, titled 6th Ranger Radio Club Mix Remix. And if we switch over to here, we got ourselves a track on the screen here, put the art up here on Spotify. Now, there are 6 songs. This is not the first time I've listened through Spaceman's work. I've also listened through some of the stuff, as well as from Bleakness of Eris. So it's going to be great to check out more. We're going to listen to each of these tracks from start till finish, and we're going to hear what we think. Starting with 6th Ranger, featuring Sora the Troll. Let's go. What do we got? Catchy little melody there with the minor leaning. Wasn't expecting a major lean with the keys. Great control of the low end as well with those basses. Great dynamic range to it. Bring it up like that. There's a catchiness, the clackiness of that, isn't there?
The message is clear.
No, I dig that. I think that there's a lot of variety within that radio club mix. But I think that's just trying to keep things interesting throughout. Because welcome to the mini conclusion of this track. There's going to be one little sort of like analysis section per song, and then finally an overall conclusion at the end where there's sort of analysis from like vocals and sort of lyrics of what the song's about all the way through studio production, as well as any applicable constructive critique, and then finally my general thoughts from a listener's perspective. But first of all, what do we think this track is about? I have been provided a little bit of a refresher from Spaceman, Spaceman 5.0, which I appreciate. It's just good to get a bit extra background on it, you know? Especially because the lyrics were kind of sparse in this one. You got kind of a feeling for it, but there's more than meets the eye. Apparently this was actually a middle song with the Bleakness of Eris project, and so what we're doing, which is kind of cool, is we're sort of reimagining these tunes to have a different affectation to it, and I think that's kind of a neat thing to do, is to explore different pathways of communicating similar sort of concepts. I think that it's great to explore the textural and musical boundaries. Apparently in this one, Z is a mannequin doll and is being trapped inside of the truth. Z becomes self-aware and mad with vengeance on truth, so she wants to get out. And I dig that. I do actually remember there's quite a bit of lore involved in this, and I think this is something that's sort of going to continue throughout this. And I just sort of want to give a shout out to the fact that when we try and approach sort of more sort of fancy element subject matters and show a clear sense of creativity, as a reviewer, I greatly appreciate it. I think the track itself is interesting by itself, structurally sort of like nice and short within that 2 to 4 minute sweet spot, you know, lots of interesting different percussive patterns and bass lines and stuff like that. But it is also just quite nice to have, you know, a bigger, wider picture surrounding it to sort of enrapture us. And the kind of voicing from Sora, those different vocal lines being done by Sora, are sort of mystical in their approach. They're occasional and they sound sort of grandiose, but I think it just sort of fits the mood and the intent of everything behind the story. So I appreciate that we focus more on the musicality of the piece as opposed to trying to sort of encumber it by a whole lot of extra context, especially with the first track. But I think it works well as a remix primarily because of sort of how occasional the wording is. You'll have to appreciate all the various sort of bass and sort of drum parts, those sort of very sort of ominous sounding synth leads, the keys, the major and minor combinations of different elements there to sort of make the harmonies twist and turn. In fact, I do just want to sort of like talk about how this track in particular seems almost like an adventure through these different realms and chapters and shades that Spaceman 5.0 is trying to present here. It really does seem like they are on that journey for vengeance, and it is there so going through all the different rooms trying to find an escape from the situation that they're in. I like the mixtures of different rhythms from the quarters, triplets, eighths, and sixteenths that are presented across the different instruments there. There are some bouncy sort of swing grooves on the keys, and the drums reinforce that as well with a great sort of sense of prominence without being too much on those kick, snare, and cymbal patterns. With some really neat syncopated sort of hi-hat parts to sort of fill in the gaps there and not make things too sort of like coordinate oriented. But it's just the sub layering, like with the keys in the background, they do the boom, 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 boom. Relatively simple melody as well, easy to follow along to, but it's just the decorating and the depth of the track that's sort of, you know, presented with those sort of like different layers and different parts of the frequency spectrum. And that drone of that sort of bass synth underneath the major keys there, the way they kind of plunk around the place and sort of dance around, it's very sort of energetic there. It's not trying to be too sort of dark or dire or on the nose about its intent, but just there's a tension there caused by the whole note sort of synth there underneath there, the buzz, that sizzle of it. And to be fair, it's not all like that. You know, you do come down in parts such as the 1 minute 05 mark where you have that bass rolling about in the deep there, not just playing the root notes, but working with the fifths as well, if I'm not mistaken there, with the portamento sort of legato technique, sort of sliding between those. The drums continuing with the chord note accents. It's just that we're changing the focus and the frequency spectrum for different parts. You may have some sort of pedal notice kind of stuff going on with that bass, and the occasional kind of clacks of the alt percussion as well. It's just nice to have different sounding hits and not just relying on one drum kit. And I do think, to be fair, when you have those wow, those kind of rises which come in now, those effects synths, just having the silence before the vocals come in does help to sort of make it more sort of chapterized, and ultimately you're both left feeling like you're in safe hands whilst also enjoying the sort of the drama to the atmosphere, I suppose. We don't ham it up with the builds or anything like that before we go into the drops. It almost kind of works like a kind of a glimpse of all the different shades or chromatics that we've got to play around with. And in moments where we sort of ponder things, like again, before we have that sort of like low resonance at the minute mark there, we've just got the fizzy sort of square synths kind of buzzing around underneath that initial motif. You really feel like if this is what we're putting into this track, what are the rest of them going to be like? But I think fundamentally in terms of like a house kind of radio club mix, it fills that purpose. Like you got to focus on the push forward, you know, allowing things to sort of be a bit more sort of floaty when they need to be, removing the drums entirely to allow the vocals to have precedence. But that kind of push and pull, that A and B side to it, I just think it helps to sort of make the transitions between a track more effective. And I think, to be fair, the minor leaning is a given there, but it's almost like we're celebrating thematically with the major keys going a bit brighter in their approach. They're a bit less faded as opposed to those minor oriented synth leads. We're suggesting that there is a sense of hope that we can get out of this sort of situation that we're in. And the fact that it's more minor than major oriented kind of makes me consider that those glimpses of hope are occasional and that we might be in for a bit of a rough time, so to speak. but just for the fact that the music tries to communicate, that allows and makes it okay that the vocals aren't as explorative or they don't explain as much. As a listener, you're kind of prompted to fill in the gaps yourself and to make assumptions. To be fair, there are some unusual parts around the 145 mark where you have that synthesizer kind of going up and down the sort of chords shapes, but like that's more to sort of be a sort of a weird kind of unusual twist in the tale, and does offer a deliberate harmonic contrast to a lot of the other more sort of straightforward stuff we have before that point. And I think there's an art to separating ourselves from an established bassline, even if we're mixing majors and minors quite adequately. Just allowing that extra bit of strangeness there to sort of illustrate how surreal it is good. But yeah, studio production, recording, mixing, mastering. There's great use of filtering, ample use of it, as well as automation on different filters and how things are presented. The music surrounds you in a stereo field. There's different intensities and different positions. There's dynamic range to the piece as well. I like how much life there is, and the use of the ceilings without squeezing things too much. Nice and loud, side chaining, bus compression limiting is handled. And the vocals that go in there seem like they fit the mood quite well. A little bit of sort of like dusting on them, a little bit of reverb just to kind of help them sit, but nothing too alien. There's just a lot more nuance that I haven't described here, but we'll be talking about this track a lot longer if I did. So still, very, very good start to proceedings, great first impression. Keen to hear more. Because we have track 2 off of the He-Mez album, The Witch of Time and Delays. Let's do it. More recent album, 2026. Great use of rises on the sides. Sounds intensely chaotic, doesn't it? But I like that. Interesting resonant frequency on my left headphone. I'm not sure if I like it that much, but if it's deliberate to make it a bit more sort of like uncomfortable, then that's fine. Adjustment of tempo here. Great use of retardando there. The Witch of Time and Delays, I want to sort of first of all get off my chest that I like the use of the delays on some of the instrumental set layers. How that ties into the title of the song is very cool. First of all, from what I understand and what I've been told, Ime is like a young lady or a princess. So I think the people that are in the album art there are different princesses, and that's inherently quite cool. This is a concept album apparently, and it's about as the everything who is the creator and destroyer splits its body into small fractions, it goes into a deep slumber. You know, that makes sense so far. These small fractions became 7 young girls with different powers and abilities at the cost of her own loyalty, as they must now watch and guard the multiverse, omniverse, from both good and evil dispersing within all the realms to maintain balance. Which, you know, I'm kind of following along with that. One of the girls among the 7 is blessed with divine or cursed with divine powers of controlling time from all realities. However, every time she uses it, her voice becomes weaker to the point of her becoming mute. But slowly but surely she becomes, well, the title speaks for itself. Having a lack of vocals at all infers that we have lost our voice now and that we're unable to sort of really communicate beyond simply the sounds that surround within the ether that we're in. With this track, you know, not having any vocals, but having a really interesting, compelling story that apparently coalesces quite neatly alongside the rest of the record. It's simply a piece where you do all go on one big adventure through it. More chaotic than the previous track, I think. With this one, we have adjustments of tempo as well, you know, like accelerando and retardando, which are really neat. It's great to sort of play around with those expectations from listeners and to sort of really make it a more sort of intense experience without feeling the need to really manipulate people. You have this sinister tonality to the early parts there in that low section where even if you hear harps, just the kind of grittiness of it it's foreboding in a sense. I think we are occasionally I think we might even be working some diminished snare, which infers a real sense of things being kind of uncomfortable and sort of mutated, I suppose. You get a real sense of danger from the offset, even if it starts quite quietly and builds up from there, or with nothing and builds up from there. When those strings come in after the ho 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 ho, you know, that big laugh there, it's immediately like, yeah, no, any suspicions you had about where the track was headed are validated at that point. And as you get those bells ring and you have again those delays that I mentioned on there, inferring more sort of a relation to what the title is, you feel like you've made a terrible decision walking into the room where all this is occurring. There's this kind of harshness to some of the tones there, which would otherwise be quite beautiful if we were using chord progressions and harmonies which didn't communicate such a sort of a sinister, sadistic state to things. When we have the keys, you know, oscillating and sort of like spreading around their range like that in the midsection, it's just very much like we're kind of counting down to something, and there's a real sense of, again, foreshadowing that things are going to get worse from here. And even when we modulate to try and make it a little bit brighter sounding, it's almost more chaotic because we're following a lot of the sort of ideas that we had before that point there. There's distorted percussive hits as well that kind of cut into a little bit, and they have this kind of cinematic feel to them, like there's something that is about to go horrifically wrong there. It tries to sort of absorb any potential cleanliness from the piano and other sort of like more melodic elements there. And as you get more of these discordant notes and chords forming across left and right hand of the keys, and you have that bass response that I mentioned in that left side there, kind of pushing at you a little bit, you feel like you're in danger. It's not nice at all. With the effects change sort of fizzing out there and the strings coming back in, sort of communicate more of what was similar there. You end the piece feeling like there has been a warping of the time that you're in. And as the choir sings you out near the end there, you've come to the end of the journey as things gradually slow down and you're just kind of left not really having understood more of what is there, just knowing that it wasn't what you needed, it wasn't what it was expected, and it's just not, yeah. The little beeps that you have harmonize nicely and infer a seventh or an octave flow to it, and we're trying to kind of resolve it, but at the same time it's not clean. It's very much like as was described. So I think there's a connection between the storytelling and what's being done musically. I don't think we needed vocals, even if they were a possibility within this. Studio recording, mixing and mastering. Again, great use of adjustment of the tempo and automation through different parts of the track to make it sort of be more of an organic experience there. I thought that was really neat. It was awesome to play with a lot of sort of lush synth textures as well there, as well as distortion to make things a bit more sort of like aggressive when required. The automation of volume at the start was also kind of nice, how things sort of rose up from there. And I do also think there's pitch shifting of certain elements there, progressive with, again, more automation. So we really just put a lot of effort into really figuring out the micro stuff with this post things. And even with the bells and the snare and the rim shots, kind of trying to provide a sense of groove there, it just felt like things were floating or thrashed about there. And it's a really neat thing to communicate in a piece like this. Again, I like the delay tails and certain elements as well, and how time was twisted. It's just it's clever songwriting. You know, I'm not glazing for the sake of it. You know, I understood this one a bit better than the other one. I think it's nice. Clearly not ideal. It's sad to hear that people are going through this, but you nonetheless appreciate and respect what the producers are trying to do. We have Terra, Priestess though, track number 6 off of the album. With Terra referring to Earth, I assume. We like those vocal chops. Drums are honestly one of the highlights of this piece. I like they were adjusting the tempo again, but I thought that would make more sense with the Witch of Time and Delays. Okay, so that was Terra, Priestess, track number 3. I felt less of a kinsmanship to this track than the previous one. I understood more directly how the music related to the title with the Witch of Time and Delays. Apparently the 6th of the 7 young girls, the Terra Priestess, who all her life was trained to become a protector of mankind. However, her own people turned her back on her, which made her give up on everything. She then instead decided to do the opposite instead with the new powers. Things have just gone horrifically wrong. They've just been abused, and now they're like, okay, well, if that's what you want, that's what you'll get. Fairly straightforward. I mean, there is an implied sense of malice with the minor letting a lot of the diminished and other sort of triad and interlude choices that we have within this piece. So I understand it from that perspective. And I think that you get this sort of stressful feeling from how the tempo rises and you have things get faster over time. I think that sort of communicates more of a danger, almost a horror aspect to it. But I don't think we needed more vocals to this other than the chops. You know, we had more context in the first piece, I think, but here it's more about, again, encouraging the listener to make the decision for themselves. It's less than 2 minutes, which I don't particularly mind. I feel like it covers itself fairly well. It might have been good to have a little more context to really sort of explain how we were supposed to get that from just listening through the track, but at the same time, half of music is making sure you appreciate it for how it is, irrespective of whether or not you know the sort of 100% of it from the musician's mouth. So still very good. You've got this choir at the start, which sounds almost sort of like a MIDI synthish kind of Vocaloid kind of thing. And it's incredibly like, oh, they're singing, mourning the loss of themselves, their own agency perhaps. And you have this kind of rumble of these strings underneath there. And it's incredibly upsetting, I suppose, not personally, but the music sounds upset. And the way it's voicing itself with their chords and the notes overlapping each other there. It's very sort of unusual. Sure, we have higher element aspects that sort of like make it a bit more sort of rounded in the frequency spectrum, but at the same time, it's a piece where you listen through it and you go, okay, yeah, no. It kind of sounds like it could either be boss battle music or that kind of weird twist in a game where it really does kind of like fly off the handle. I will talk about the rhythm section primarily because like I feel like even though there's a 1, 2, 3 overall kind of flow to it, it's just so neat to have all these sub-16ths and other elements there. With the drum kit that really doesn't have much underneath 150 hertz, if I'm not mistaken there. We're really not trying to provide any sort of kick emphasis to it. It really is meant to sort of sound floaty and almost sort of like operatic in its response. But yeah, we really are heavily filtering the drum kit there. As things get faster, I think we maybe just thought they're allowing that sort of low end would be just a little bit too heavy. And that's totally fine. It's just quite a complicated beat there with the different cymbals and snares and like bells or even tambourines or something like that. I kind of dig that we're committing to the bit a little bit, especially with the earth being quite heavy. As we kind of slow down at the end there, you hear the snare kind of choked in the mix a little bit, almost like it's compressing upon itself. And ultimately, it's just, like we don't overstay our welcome. There's no filler within this track. There's been no filler within the other 2 tracks. Spaceman 5.0 is attentive to the needs of both their song and the person, sort of checking them out either for the first time or the 10th. It doesn't try to explain itself too much. Again, you really do need to understand the lore, but nonetheless, I like a lot of what we're trying to accomplish here. And just that loud kind of from the start there. It's just having that as like the starting point is like, oh, okay, we have a sub drop. Why do we have a sub drop? And thematically, with the mixture of minors and diminished, it leaves you in a state of really going, okay, why would I have expected this to have become more uplifting or positive? Really, we're kind of going through the tragedies of the individual people involved in this. And outside of our own expectations or maybe a preference to potentially feel less comfortable, it's still solid music there with careful attention. We aren't as explorative with the major minors as we were within the first track of these. But I just think within the He-Mez album, you don't need to over-decorate it. But it's just complicated minors and diminished. It's different piano parts there, playing complicated melodies there that don't typically brush up against vocals like that, but we're not afraid to take risks because we're not trying to sugarcoat the experience. And those like spicy 16th note hits as a closing sort of statement there. In terms of the production, are filtered, making the drums far more sort of like laid back and less intense than they would be otherwise. And I kind of dig that production approach. I think that if everything had been almost as stock, except with a bit of sort of like functional EQing there, it just maybe would have sounded a little bit too normal. Having things differently presented there with a sort of an ethereal mystical glow there adds a bit of sort of mystique to it. A solid effort as well, just on a couple of notes before we finish, with the loud kicks, the accented ones for the occasional sort of like loop start, finish and start times. They're objectively louder than a lot of the other parts, but because of the smoothness of the production, and the tightness of it, they don't sound too abrupt. They kind of filter out with after the sidechaining kicks in with the which I think is kind of neat. It makes it sound a bit more atmospheric. And the closing note of dun 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 is just, it puts you on edge. We're letting the listener know that the album isn't done yet and letting them know that they're not safe yet. Now, I should also note that apparently we have a metal version of Terra Priestess, which I am interested to listen through. This will be really cool. Let's do it. What do we got? How will it be metal? It's a very fizzy guitar tone. Great switch to normal time. I mean, I can hear the double kicks. They're just a little bit subdued because of where the mix is focused. So I want to sort of approach Terra Priestess Metal Mix version less from the object perspective of sort of discussing what we think the track's about, and more about how it sort of differentiates from the main track, which I take to be those predominant sort of like guitar and drum focuses. Literally, the descriptor I have been provided is it has more metalness, and I would agree with that. I think that just to discuss both the guitar and drums, how they performed, what they add to it, and the production styling of them, I thought that the guitar typically being more sort of like a rhythm-oriented element there with a mixture of alternate power, sort of like palm-muted, chugged chords there. Double tracked as well, which is really good. I like the fact that we're double tracking those guitars. And we could have potentially have had a bit more sort of low end with those, but it's okay if we wanted a fizzier kind of sound to them. They definitely did stand out in the mix. And it was great to also have that variety of different sort of drum layers there with lots of different double kicks, snares, lots of the rides, and they were kind of prominent in a way where I get along with it because of the fact that it just kind of adds a bit of sort of like a stabby kind of like, it works well alongside some of the bells we've had in other tracks and stuff like that, I suppose, as a kind of a pairing there. I would have potentially have liked to have had more presence for like the kicks in particular in the frequency response to the track and the frequency spectrum. I think part of that is simply because there were some things that were sort of competing for attention there. Some parts of the drum kit that were maybe a bit louder or a bit quieter than others. But I think that's simply us, maybe also could be the headphones that I'm using. I think nonetheless the original had a propensity for the kind of harder, kind of darker sound to it, so I don't mind at all that we're trying to add more sort of distorted textures to it. And I do think as well the variety of different half-time and double-time grooves that we have on the kit, exploring the toms really neatly, again switching between different cymbals, very, very comfortable, allowing us to have some breakdowns as well as some sort of gallops there. There's enough going on in different parts with the drums and guitars to feel like this is a separate experience with this Terra Priestess Metal Mix version, which is kind of the epitome of what we need in that advance there. You know, we're not trying to completely remove the purpose of the original track we had, we're just kind of adding more to it in a way that doesn't make it superfluous. And I do think as well, just the minor leaning there, the tone and the tension, I said tension a lot there. The sense of kind of mystical loss that we get from the keys and the chorus and everything like that in the original do meld together with the brittle nature of those guitar concepts. And the single strip kind of they're just fun. It's just fun to explore not only the diatonics but certain chromatics parts as well. Like the Phrygian, for example, was a great scale or mode to use in certain situations there, flattening the second. And I think also as a final note, to be able to sort of keep up with the increase in the tempo that we had like past the halfway of the track as well, to sort of play along with that and not try and make it too constant to make the drums easier was just an awesome move. So ultimately, yeah, I do think it was additive. It's just the guitar tone and maybe a bit more clarity, some of the drum elements within the mix, but that's okay. Like ultimately, otherwise, I think we can hear things clearly, and it's just maybe getting used to one style of mixing and getting used to the other, you know. We got track number 5 though, Seraphim 1 or Light and Despair. Let's do it. Adjustment to the snares there. Heavily reverb those drums though, haven't we? slaps. Not gonna lie, kind of slaps. I recognize this theme a little bit for someone who's not quite sure how to place it. Granted, it could have been produced earlier, represented earlier, but and that was Seraphim 1, Light and Despair. Just, I like the sound of what we had going on there. I still can't necessarily place why we are affecting the drum kit like that and what allows, what the decision making behind that was. Again, if we like the sound of the drums in that situation, that's totally fine. No complaints whatsoever. It's more just a general curiosity on my part, is there's a lot removed in terms of the frequency response and the actual attack of those hits. But Seraphim 1, Light and Despair. Apparently the blind girl, leader of the 7 girls, was unsure on what path to take since she was fascinated by both heaven and hell. Cast aside and burned alive, she comes back as a Seraphim angel of light and despair to cast supreme judgment on both good and bad. She's always keeps her eyes closed and to believe she's still blind and only opens them when she's ready to deliver her judgment. Okay, I kind of understand what we're going for there with this one. The light, them being the light and then bringing the despair with their judgment on both good and bad there. And I feel like that's, again, just genuinely the lore is cool. I love the creativity there. I mean it. I know you shouldn't have to say you're being genuine if you're being genuine, but just sometimes I'm not sure how things communicate over the microphone. I don't think you needed vocals. And this one, I think, again, it's more moods and atmospheres that we're trying to create here. So I think that an instrumental part is thoroughly sufficient, especially if we can kind of hint at things either with use of samples, for example, or if simply we can maybe sort of like use something that we've heard in the previous track to kind of tie that back in. Whatever works. There is such a sense of animosity at the start though. There's a kind of a tribal rumbling that is going on at the beginning of the piece there with the use of those 16s. Some kind of glitchy textures there to provide a sense of, oh, actually, what are we doing? What danger is this? What universe are we in? I think that the mixture of toms in that part are kind of neat as well as the kicks. When we bring the snares and some of the cymbals in, you can definitely hear them. They're just a bit subdued because of the intense reverb and filtering that we have on the kit. And I think that that's a great thing. You know, despite what I'm talking about in terms of the actual way it's produced, I'm still not convinced on the way that it is sort of communicated to us in terms of the post-production. It's just nice to have that sort of rhythmic diversity to those percussive elements. Because we have the 16th underlying groove, and then we have those strings coming on the 8ths there. And we play some sort of like diminished or sort of minor triads there, and it almost sounds like we're going through a Marvel film or something like that there. The villain has appeared. And as we have those cascading sort of like the keys there that really just do illustrate a further sense of despair or danger, you kind of understand how the intro kind of like lore navigates to that. And there are deliberately kind of like difficult sounding combinations of elements within this, I think, to sort of again communicate that things are not what they seem. They are not ideal. This is not a pretty situation. Moving to that sort of lower section there, changing tempo with the choir coming back in, almost sort of like hearkening the rebirth there, is kind of a sensational concept there. Just we're not trying to overcomplicate the mood shift or the vibe shift, where we imply it inherently through that there. And even though we do return to like a faster speed later on there, it's just really cool for things to shift like that, as opposed to maybe needing to keep the same tempo or it's like adjusting from like normal to halftime or halftime to double time, etc. And we're doing more of that kind of like adjustment to the tempos as well, going up and down there in the last 30 seconds of the piece there. Kind of like things are stumbling about in the dark there. or tumbling into the darkness, the shadowy abyss after being judged. Ultimately, though, when I listen to this and I think about what was provided in terms of context or feedback to it, with the largely rhythmic focus being rather compelling in terms of simply being a great groove to listen to, having enough sort of compositional diversity to keep things interesting. Structurally, I think it elicits a slowdown, the judgment being presented, and then things being sped up and going down in order to let the person know that the time has come. So I think any deliberate sort of like dysfunctional sort of diminished or any sort of like fourth harmonies or anything like that I meant to sound a little bit unsettling are deliberately done in order to again make up for a lack of vocals here to sort of further communicate the piece or its intent, which it does well. Nothing overstays its welcome here, and ultimately, again, I think at 2:37 form factor, it's exactly where it needs to be. I think there are enough more sort of straightforward textures and timbres with some of the instruments here to make up for a lack of being able to sort of appreciate the drums. Finish with the piano like that as well after everything fades out is kind of neat as well. It's because again it sounds like we're tumbling with that slower tempo, but also it's just a nice way to provide a sense of faux dynamic range from a production perspective. Even when things are quite well handled in the compression department, there's nothing that's choked, which I like. It's not trying to be a nice sort of song to listen to. I should note that despite the production being quite well done, it's harmonically a song which kind of pushes against what you maybe sort of prefer to appreciate or be listening to in terms of like well-behaved sort of like majors or minors or like fours or sis2s or even the sevenths or ninths there, which can be sometimes a bit more challenging. Here we're deliberately kind of adding sort of diminished sort of tritones into play, really to sort of like elicit a sense of things being mucked up. And I just like how unfiltered we are with that. You know, we're not afraid to put that in there for effect and to sort of, we'll build. Now for the last track though, Seraphim middle mix version with Bleakness of Eris as well, I should mention. This is 6 minutes 21. So this is the longest song we've had so far. Be interesting to see hear what they do with the longer, more real estate. That bass is feral, dude. Yeah, we're deliberately producing it like this. Yeah, we're deliberately, I mean, we had that before, giving us a remix. Inverted organs. Nice. mean, it's definitely metal, for sure. Taps. I mean, that bass tone's filthy though, dude. They just did not have that with some of those guitar parts back there. Okay.
光と絶望のセラフィムエンジェル。光、姫たちよ、立ち上がれ。過去も現在も未来も事実として実現させようではないか。
The animated villain has entered the building. Sense to have a breakdown here, because after that spoken part, you know, seems like the big finish. I mean, I'm genuinely impressed with the outro part. I thought that was sensational. It sounded so lush and full sounding. It was great to have that big part. And I do think having the bell, then the spoken part, and then the rest of it was a sensible move there, because it allowed for that extension to occur. I think that if we hadn't had that bell, if we just gone straight into another guitar riff, even if it was some really cool ideas that we had there, and structurally, you know, this track is quite sound, it's just knowing to get chapterized, to have that prompt there, boom, part 2, done. Great use of 6.5 minutes. So apparently this one, just as a note, an aside, it features digital and analog drums. And I think that that's a smart move here. So I want to just quickly, we'll talk about this track in full, but just a shout out that I love when people play the drums and their tracks in this music. It's really nice to hear someone getting on the kit and having that little bit of sort of like, because you don't need to humanize it that way. You got that sort of natural dynamic range to the performance, and as long as the performance is rhythmically quite tough, you usually carry, and it can be honestly inherently more interesting than like a lot of music where you sort of quantize it to make it sound perfect. But with that in mind, I think this is going to be a similar sort of like ending section to what we had with The Witch of Time and Delays Middlebex versus the original. I think it carries the same story. Again, I'm not sure what we're discussing in Japanese and that mid part there. I just feel like the person talking down to the princess potentially, or it could be the person, the Terra Priestess offering judgment, I'm not sure. Either way, it's just fascinating. Having the guitars and drums and that really sort of heavy bass, and let's just talk about that bass tone for a sec. It's not just that it was thick and full sounding and had a nice sort of distortion and glow to it. and it filled out the frequency spectrum so nicely at the low end. There was not a lot really competing for its attention. Granted, there were other basses throughout these tracks that we listened through today, but that was just superb. It was really well bodied. It leaves us to discuss the purpose and functionality of the guitar and the drums within this track. The guitars did more than what we've heard previously, like, such as in the Witch of Time and Delay Metal Mix version. They had several different guitar solo sections with a mixture on one side of the tapping, and the other parts like lots of unison bends and interesting sort of like bluesy phrasings with that. And I just kind of dig that we're allowing ourselves to express different kinds of guitar playing in different ways. Some sort of neoclassical feel and the other more sort of contemporary rock and metal and B. And it's cool because what we have going on there is an awareness that, with a longer track, we need to provide more sort of structural diversity within it. We can't just rely on copy and pasting the same 1 minute something of what we had before there. We need to justify these instruments or a remix of it through adding additional content, and that way adding different sort of like alternate pick guitar riffs there, playing a lot alongside a lot of the pre-established harmonies and melodies and sort of rhythm sections that we had alongside, the original version of Seraphim. But it's just knowing again to decorate with those guitar solo sections, allow us to have a really sort of full sounding breakdown, the end going between half time and double time and normal time. And a lot of that, to be fair, comes down to the drums with a mixture of different double kick patterns, cymbal and snare and hi-hat grooves there, seamless transitions between parts. Again, it's not just having the same drum kit, it's allowing some electronic parts and then some sort of more sort of acoustically oriented parts there, deliberately separating them and making them more distinct so that as a listener you understood which was which there. We're not trying to obfuscate. That reminded me a bit of old school Iron Maiden or some other parts there in that solo section around 320 and 25 with the drums, to be fair, as well as the guitars there, but just to kind of hear the kind of gallops and bouncy 8ths and 16ths on the kicks there, to hear the crashes and hi-hats sort of scintillating around the place, to make it seem so sort of like it's a live performance there, to kind of remove ourselves potentially from a lot of what we might be sort of expecting throughout other tracks, such as, again, The Witch of Time and Delays is just really neat, It kind of gives you the impression that they could play this live and it would sound really cool. And like, even when we're speeding up the piano arpeggios on the right hand, those existing sort of triads that are replicated and sort of like established in different parts there, whether we're holding the guitar chords or whether we're sort of like playing because there's been like polyrhythmic and polymeterish kind of other elements within some of the instrumental parts within these tracks. There's a lot that I haven't spoken about, and it would take a while to kind of break everything down. But there's not a note out of place either. Like, I can't hear any bits where the drum rhythm playing on the guitar sounds messy. I think there's a nice sort of rhythmic consistency to a lot of the sort of triplet decisions, for example, on the tie-dip stuff. I think there's a lot of rhythmic consistency, some like the lead parts of the guitar with like the tap stuff and everything like that as well. It's nice that it's not completely sort of like random or sort of like distracted or disjointed from a lot of what other things are going on within the piece. The symmetry with those lead lines from a production perspective was kind of neat as well, how it went backwards and forwards. And the bell tolling for these structurally in the middle there was just a great sort of symbol. The vocals being so much of a sometimes thing gives them extra sort of importance, and you pay attention to those, not knowing what's going to happen next. We go almost sort of Dream Theater-ish at the end with the 16th triplets on the kicks there, and we're just left not really necessarily knowing where we've gotten to, but nonetheless sort of focused with a minor thematic feel. Bearing in mind, most of these tracks are typically minor and sort of like flat 5 oriented. There aren't a lot of really particularly happy sounding tracks within these 6 that we've listened to today. I don't think these are particularly positive sounding situations. I think harmonically, thematically, it makes a lot of sense, but it's great to sort of mix in a lot of different notes from the relative minor scales and sort of diatonics and stuff to make it better than simply, or more interesting than simply 1-3-5. And a lot of that comes down to the way that the piano continues to be integrated alongside the distorted guitars, bass and drums. And as a final comment just on the production of the guitars in general, I know that they set it down kind of thin in the previous track, like the 4th one. I will kind of take it back a little bit. It kind of reminds me of the production style of a lot of metal guitars in the 80s and the way they were done, and they launched entire genres like thrash and stuff like that. And there were some sort of thrashy elements within this piece as well, so I've got no issues with it whatsoever. It's very, very good. It is a long track though, so I think it might be a bit alien to people who are not sort of ready for it, but I nonetheless feel like it's at least an intriguing end to proceedings of the Hime's Metal Mix Versions album. I think, do I like the middle mix version or I do like the middle mix version more because there's more sort of like diversity, but I feel like the initial one also in that smaller form factor is very good. We're going to talk about each of these 6 tracks more in the conclusion. Because welcome to the conclusion of my review of these 6 tracks from an act named Spaceman 5.0 featuring acts Sora the Troll as well as Bleakness of Eris. In this section I'm going to be providing an overall analysis of these tracks from very occasional vocals of what the tracks are about, all the way through to studio production as well as any applicable constructive critique, and then my final general thoughts from a listener's perspective. But first of all, what do I think these tracks are about? I mean, I've spoken about them in the individual sort of like mini conclusions per song, so feel free to double check them. This is not the same project, so to speak, even though this is Spaceman's fourth side project. It's more what I'm trying to communicate is that each track is very sort of personal to itself. The Hime's album is more about these different princesses who have had sort of tragic backstories, as I understand it, such as the Witcher Time Delays, Terra, Priestess, and Seraphim. And each of them, to be clear, has got their own sort of original version, as if I understand correctly, as well as a middle version. And I think there are merits to both. Typically, the main difference between these is the originals have like an absence of like the harder guitar, bass, and drums, if I'm not mistaken, whereas the middle versions have the heavier elements within it. None of them are particularly vocal oriented. I mean, to be fair, the 6th Ranger Radio Club remix did have more sort of spoken vocal lines in there, and we did have a little speech within the last track, Seraphim middle mix version. But to be fair, part of that I think was because it was 6 minutes at that point. Ultimately, you kind of need to know the lore off of the beaten track in order to really fully appreciate these, but from just simply a listener's perspective, I did enjoy listening through these tracks. There was stuff to appreciate within all of them, even if, to be fair, after a while I kind of became very sort of comfortable or sort of like aware of similar design decisions, such as, again, the focus on the minors with the diminished stare and the chromatics. But again, I think there was stuff to appreciate. Just ultimately, I think it's more about the individual tracks and their own sort of concepts, as opposed to trying to have an overall thing. It just seemed like at the moment this is mainly aimed at discussing the trials and tribulations of either princesses or people that have been trapped in different situations, and I genuinely love the imagination involved with these. So outside of the vocals, which I think have either been done by Sora the Troll or others, what have you got within this? What is the situation we're in? 6 tracks that vary between like 1 minute 45 or something like that, all the way up to 6 minutes 21. I don't think there was any filler. I was a little bit sort of like nervous when I saw that the Seraphim middle mix version was 6:21, but I think that having the guitar solo section as well as the extended breakdown at the end after the bells and vocal part was totally fine. It kind of sold it for me. It indicated to me that Spaceman 5.0 is comfortable with not only having your typical sort of like shorter form factor pieces there, which are more sort of experimental and sort of through composed, but you also are comfortable with bringing in ideas and presenting them in different ways with a mixture of different rhythmic patterns from the use of, again, of those sort of like metal drums, quote unquote, with the use of the double kicks, the 16th triplets, 32nds, 8s, quarters, 16s, etc. With the guitars providing a wide variety of sort of like rhythmic focuses, such as the sort of alternate sort of chugged power chord elements there, string skipped parts as well, some sort of new metal-ish kind of da-da-da-da-da-da kind of stuff, but also again, as I said, the solo section with a mixture, a variety of different sort of tapped and sort of use and bend patterns that was not in all of the tracks, but I think primarily, as far as I'm aware, in Seraphim, which was good, just a nice palette cleanse. The bass that we had within some of these tracks, especially Seraphim, was golden. I love how full-bodied it was. The sizzle, the glow to it just gave me life. It filled out frequency spectrum really neatly. Just we didn't just play the root notes to be filled with the bass lines. We did experiment a little bit with different notes within the diatonic or minor scales presented, because a lot of this music was typically minor or sort of like Phrygian or sort of like diminished oriented, their tritones, etc. We're trying to sort of communicate a sense of darkness through these pieces, which I think, again, harmonically we did quite well. It's just that the bass was the ground floor and anchor. And to be fair, I wasn't there all the time. There were some parts where I feel like the guitars could have had like a bass line underneath, but they just wanted to sort of maybe sort of like experience a floatiness, or sort of just suggest it at least, which is totally fine. Ultimately, though, I think the middle mix versions with the use of those were great. But outside of the middle mix versions, the more sort of traditional ones, We had a variety of electronic drum patterns as well there, working with our quarters, 8ths and 16ths, interesting sort of like on-beat sort of chord note accents with quarters and snares, but also some 8th and 16th note patterns, both on-beat and syncopated, depending on where we're at. We also had moments where there weren't any drums because we knew that things needed to float, the other sort of like mid to upper range textures, as well as occasionally the bass as well, which is totally fine. We had some effects layers as well, more sort of like for riser effects going up and down, or just noises or like sub drops as well at the start of pieces. And they were more sort of indicating a sense of drama and suspension tension in there. I think that was important, not necessarily required, but nonetheless important, because it further enabled us to really sort of appreciate the depravity of the situation, especially if we weren't really sure of the lore behind it. Those were occasional ear candy-ish things, and more to the point, there were more common parts like the keys, the synth patterns, some of the strings, etc., which really did sort of ground and anchor those sort of suspicions about the direction of the piece emotionally in a way that was rather satisfying, despite how sort of tenuous certain parts were. Piano in particular, especially in like tracks like Witch of Time and Delays, there was kind of manic and very sort of like it was tense and stressful, and you really did not feel like things were going to resolve themselves very well. I don't have an issue with that personally. And like you had this kind of like huge reverb sort of compression, this delayed reverb tails to the drums there that made them sound very sort of airy and distant there. And the keys had more sort of push to them in certain elements there that were kind of a sort of a flip on what you maybe get with the other way around with a lot of music. But I think again, it's just having the keys cascade like that, not just playing sort of like some major orients like we had in the first track, Six Ranger Radio Club remix, to sort of soften things a bit. Other points within this album, we were really sort of straight on the nose with it. And even if we modulated or if we adjusted the tempo, sped things up or slowed things down, because that's another point as well. Rhythmically, this track played around not only with the main sort of rhythms of eighth quarters, etc., across a wide variety of instruments and even sort of vocal takes. But it also sped the tempo up, automated that volume there, and sort of brought it up or brought it down in different intervals. Sometimes it just completely sort of just changed lick split in the middle. And it's like, why? Why was that context provided? With occasional sort of like accented sub drops for kicks. Like you're left kind of trying to figure out why they were doing that. But again, the tracks would sometimes stumble downward as well there. It was a very organic experience rhythmically. Just having the keys play alongside that whilst the strings kind of festered in certain elements as well and really sort of stuck to the lows majority of the time was kind of neat. You know, having the kind of the entire string with the synth pads there issue a sense of foreboding with how they again applied those minors and sort of diminished triads to it. That made total sense to me. And there were some harsher distorted textures as well that were included amongst the synths and the keys. There were some sequences, there were other pads, other sort of basses, a wide variety of other instruments like bells occasionally, such as in the last track, Seraphim, Middle Mix. And they were actually in a Witch of Time and Delays as well there. Like the bell is tolling to thee before judgment. Like it's great to have callbacks and continuity across the album in terms of instruments that were present, with occasional brass and other elements I'm probably forgetting as well. Those are just the main ones that I remember there. I think it's testament to Spaceman 5.0. They're able to include so much within these pieces while still... It's like the scale choices and melodies and themes were kind of consistent enough with some of the emotional responses that you could kind of pick that they are connected, but no track felt this, actually no, like track felt totally isolated. There was no filler within any of these tracks. Again, I was concerned with the last track, Seraphim Middle Mix, but no, we didn't have any filler within that. We had that pause and then spoken part and then that final outro bit, so that was fine. And ultimately, despite, again, the darkness and the negative subjectivity to this piece, there was no note out of place, and there was not... I think in general the performance was good, and I think again the vocals that we had with Sora and stuff like that sat well in the mood. I think because of how they were presented with the production effects chains and how occasional they were, plus forcing you to pay closer attention to those. The studio recording, mixing, and mastering in general, I think was good. Again, there were a lot of stylistic decisions made, again, such as the production of the drums kind of taking a lot of the low end and making them kind of fluffier up in the top, while still allowing some of the sub drops to and occasional accented kicks to have for loop endings and restarts to have that kind of presence and body to it. I think that was totally fine. I think generally, again, the keys, strings, guitars, bass drums, etc. were well positioned within the frequency spectrum and the stereo field. There was asymmetry with the way different things were presented. Sometimes it'd just be like a low end on this side, but I think that just makes it more interesting to listen to when things are uneven, as long as it doesn't become dysfunctional or sort of like distracting, you know. There was dynamic range to this music. It wasn't the same loudness the entire time. There was automation of the volume, automation of the filtering, automation of the tempo as well. Lots of fun with post-production. You know, really seemed to know our stuff in that regard. Nothing sounded overproduced. Again, I just think it would have been nice to have had a little bit of more sort of body to the sort of guitar, a little bit more low end, but I think we were trying to allow enough room for the bass in there, so it was totally fine, as well as other elements. Nice and loud, bit of pumping, bus compression, limiting is handled, and ultimately, I just think, aside from what I mentioned about some of the guitar takes and the drums and how they're presented and stuff like that, ultimately, I think if they were deliberate decisions, that kind of bypasses it anyways. Again, with the way that we've managed to include things here, I think there was a track where I was sort of like really sort of unsure about some of the drum parts, the acoustic drum parts in general, how they appeared. But I think with what I've heard, maybe we're trying to deliberately sort of, again, make them less obvious, in part due to having sort of deliberately less EQing on certain parts to add a sense of organic sort of production to it. It's interesting. Again, I think there's a limit to the assumptions you can make. But you can nonetheless appreciate the musicality of it, and in general, it was like pleasant to listen to. Again, despite how kind of angsty it was at times. From a general listener's perspective, it's just a very sort of unique experience. I've listened to a lot of music like this recently, where it's been kind of ambient or experimental or very sort of creative, and I mean creative in a genuine way. It's like I haven't listened to much music like this, and I've done thousands of reviews at this point, and I like that. That's the case. It makes me sad when people feel like they need to fit into a box. I like that Spaceman 5.0, you know, everyone else involved in this is doing fun things with music. I wish them all the best of luck in future. I think genuinely interesting concept. I feel like you'd need to listen to the whole of the He-Maze to kind of really get what it's about, and then maybe listen to the middle version of it to sort of like really fill it up. I think the 6th Ranger Radio Club remix alone by itself is a great concept. And I wish Spaceman 5.0 all the best of luck in future, because thank you for watching my review of this album from an act name, not an album, should I say, most of the album, some of the album, from Spaceman 5.0. There's 6 tracks off of the He-Maze, the non-metal and metal versions, as well as 6th Ranger. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please go show them some love via the various social medias and the Spotify page, and stay cool and stay safe, and please remember to support your local musicians in Eris at this point in time, as they need the help more than ever with all the crazy stuff going on in the world. And I'll catch you in the next SP Reacts. Spiderhands out.